Hi everyone, my name is Ryan, and in this video I'm going to talk about the if function in Microsoft Excel. So just something really quick up front. So I'm using Microsoft Office 2016 on a PC with Windows 10. If you are running a different version of Microsoft Excel, or if you are using a Mac or have a different operating system, things might look slightly different for you, but overall this tutorial should still work and make sense. So let's jump into it. So first I want to talk about what the if function is. So the if function is a logical test that lets um, Excel return one value if your logical test is true and another value if your logical test is false. And so what exactly is a logical test? So a logical test would be something like 5 equals 5. Um, Clearly, 5 equals 5 is a true statement, and so if that were our logical test, Excel would return whatever value you've told it to return if your logical test is true, and would not return the value you tell it to return if it's false. 3 is greater than 7 is also a logical test, but in this case, 3 is greater than 7 is false. And so Excel would return whatever you've told it to return if the value from your logical test is false. So this can be a very powerful function. Just if you have the need to return something assuming some cell meets a certain criteria. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of the function. So your function is going to look like this. So you have equals if, you open your parentheses. Your first argument for this function is the logical test, so that would be the thing like 5 equals 5. But you can also use cell references. So you could put in here if, open parentheses, A1 is equal to A2. And so this would look at whatever is in cell A1 in your worksheet and whatever is in cell A2 in your worksheet. And if they were equal, it would say true. If they are not equal, it would say false. The second argument is the value you want Excel to return if your logical test is true. And the third argument is the value you want Excel to return if your logical test is false. So let's look at an example of how to put these together. So let's assume that you are a teacher and you've got grades for your students at the end of the semester, including a final grade, and you know what your grading scale looks like to give everyone a letter and also to determine who's passed and who's failed. So let's start with who's passed and who's failed. So in this column, I want to return a P if the student's grade is a passing grade, and an F if the student's grade is a failing grade. So we can look down here at our grading scale and see that an F is a failing grade would be anything between 0 and 69, and a passing grade would be anything from 100 all the way down to a 70. So let's put that into an if statement. So we can say equals if, and open parentheses, our final grade is greater than or equal to a 70, and I'm going to use a cell reference here. So instead of typing in 70%, which would just be a manual entered number, I'm going to select my cell reference here, and I'm going to lock it so that it's an absolute cell reference. So we're saying that if the student's grade is greater than or equal to a 70, that would mean that they've passed. And so if the value of that statement is true, I want to return a P. And so to return a P, I open quotation marks and put in P, and I close quotation marks. You have to use quotation marks here anytime that you want to return a text string. If you want to return a value instead, like if you wanted to be a 1, you would just put in a 1. And then the number 1 would return if this statement is true. So let's put in our quotes P, and then we put in another comma, and our value, if false, is going to be that the student receives a failing grade. And then we close our parentheses, and we press enter. And then because I locked my reference here, but I didn't lock my reference here, if I copy and paste these down, my relative references flow down with the formula, but my locked reference stays on the 70%, and we can see that only one student failed the course. There are other ways that you could have put this logical statement together. So let's actually just recreate one. So if instead of doing greater than or equal to 70, I wanted to think about less than or equal to 69, we could say equals if the grade is less than or equal to 69, F4, then, so if it's less than or equal to a 69, that means the student has failed the course. So we would return an F in that case if it's true, and a P if it's false. Enter, and then we can copy our formula down. It's the same result. It's the same logical test, just with a slightly different way to go about it. So the next thing we want to look at is nesting if statements. So what do I mean by nesting if statements? So I mean putting an if statement inside of an existing if statement. And I think the easiest way to show that is really to just jump into an example. So let's say here we wanted to return letter grades for our students. So we know here that an A is between a 93 and 100, B is between 85 and 92, etc., etc. So let's show how to do this. So let's start with our A's. So we would say equals if your student's grade is greater than or equal to a 93, then we want to give them an A. Now, if it's false, that means our student's grade is less than a 93. But instead of giving them a grade here, I want to nest an if statement. So I'm going to say if, and then I can move on to all of the other letter grades. So if the student's grade is greater than or equal to an 85, then they get a B. And if that's not true, we're working with everything below an 84. And so now, if the student's grade is greater than or equal to a 78, then they get a C. And lastly, if the student's grade is greater than or equal to a 70, they get a D. And now, since we don't have any other if statements we would need to nest into this, we've covered every letter except an F. If none of those so far has been true, then it must be the case the student got an F. And so we can close the parentheses, but we have to close the parentheses on every if statement. So that one that I just put in closed the parentheses on this if statement. Next, I want to close parentheses on this entire if statement, then on this entire if statement, and finally on my whole overarching if statement. I'm going to do one other thing. I forgot to lock this cell reference, so I'm going to do that. And then I can press enter. And my letter grade for this student, which got a 71.7, falls into the D category. They get a D. And now, because I locked the appropriate references, I can copy this down, and I have the letter grade for each individual student. So the last thing that I want to talk about is nesting and or functions, so other logical functions, logical test functions inside of your if statement. So what we just saw was in the if statement, we were nesting an if statement inside of the value if false. Now what I want to do is nest an if statement inside of this logical test, or sorry, nest another logical statement inside of this logical test. So let me show you how we would do that. So if I go back to our examples, so let's say the teacher every year gives a special award to any students who receive an A on all 3 of their grades. And this is a very small data set, so you could look at this very easily and say, the only person here who got an A on all 3 of their grades is this one right here. So they got a 95, a 93, a 96. All of those are A's. They win the special award. No one else did. But let's say your data set had 100 or 200 or 300 or 1,000 students. You wouldn't want to look at each of them individually. You could put a formula together. So let's build that. So we would do equals if, and then for our logical test, we want to use an AND function. So we want to say and the AND function will return true if every logical statement inside of it is true. If one of them is false, the AND function will return false. So our first logical is going to be that grade 1 for this student is greater than or equal to a 93. And I'm going to lock the 93. And then I put a comma to tell Excel I want to put in my second logical statement. So my second logical statement is that grade 2 is greater than or equal to a 93. I lock the 93. And my third logical statement is that grade 3 is greater than or equal to a 93, and I lock the 93. And then I can close my parentheses because I'm done with my AND statement. And so let's take a step back and see what this does. So the AND statement here is going to say, is B3 greater than or equal to B12, which is a 93, true or false? Is C3 greater than or equal to B12, true or false? And is D3 greater than or equal to B12, true or false? And so you're going to have 3 true or false statements returned, and as long as all 3 of them are true, this entire portion, which is our entire logical test of the if statement, will return true, but only if all 3 of these are true. So now that we've built our logical test, we can put a comma to fill out what we want to say if it's true. So if that's true, let's say that we return a yes. And if it's false, meaning at least one of their grades was not an A, we'll return a no. And then we can close our parentheses and hit enter. And then we can copy this down. And as we saw at the beginning of this, Hermione is the only student who got an A on all 3 grades. So she has a yes here in the special awards. I do want to show you what this would look like as an OR function instead. So if everything about the structure of this was the same except I used an OR, the OR function says, is at least one of these logical statements that I've put in true? So is B3 greater than B12, or C3 greater than or equal to B12, or D3 greater than or equal to B12? If at least one of those is true, then this entire statement returns a true for our logical test. So let's see what that would look like. So if the teacher gives a special award for any student who receives an A on at least one grade. So if we hit enter and then we copy that down, every student received at least one A except for Ginny. So that's everything for this video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, be sure to press the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thanks and have a great day.